Hey everyone, Ryan here from the Duly Diagnosed podcast, and today we're talking about the different types of healthcare professionals that you'll find working in a drug and alcohol rehab setting. So because there's so much that I want to cover, this video is going to be one of a series that I'm going to do over a period of weeks. If you like this video, remember to subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss out on any new videos in the series. Before we get started, I want to make a quick note on registered and unregistered rehab centers. So all rehabs in South Africa are required to be registered in terms of a very specific piece of legislation, which has a really long name, but we'll just call it Act 70 of 2008. So this act was the successor to Act 20 of 92, and there were a number of reasons for this, but we aren't going to go into that in this video. So the 2008 Act specifically makes note that all of its regulations apply to any person who renders services related to substance abuse. So this includes anyone who wants to open and run an inpatient rehab center, a halfway house, or an outpatient program. Part of the Act includes a policy called the Minimum Norms and Standards, and this gives an overview of guidelines for rehabs, halfway houses, and outpatient program. It also gives detailed definitions, references to other acts, and specifies specific policies and procedures. Again, it's very specific and it's designed to ensure that rehabs are held to a respectable standard. The whole process of registration is managed by the Department of Social Development and the Department of Health, and these departments also oversee the registration process from start to finish. So the Act is extensive for a reason. Over the years, there have been hundreds of rehabs start up that claim to provide legitimate, ethical, and evidence-based treatment modalities, all the while operating in very dodgy and conspicuous ways.
But we bring you this now. Questions are being raised about the mushrooming of unregistered rehabilitation centers.
And what they said was that no, Muhammad was unruly, and then they, to put him right, they tied him to a pole. And he had shambok marks on his back.
Am I correct in saying that he was at a treatment center at the time when this happened?
That's correct. We know that rehabs have started and are in place by people who actually want to do good. Others are wanting to make money. But the challenge is that it's not being facilitated properly by government to ensure rehabs are compliant.
If you take anything from this video, remember that if you are wanting to use the services of a rehab center, make sure to check that it's registered. The reality is that treatment centers that aren't registered are operating outside of the confines of the law, and this can be incredibly damaging for any of the victims that are exploited by these places. Even if on the surface of things the place looks like its intentions are good, be very careful. I would even suggest taking this a step further and making sure that the rehab is staffed appropriately in terms of the Act. We'll go through that in a bit. The Act also outlines who can provide treatment at rehabs, halfway houses, and outpatient programs. So these professionals normally include medical doctors, psychiatrists, professional nurses, psychologists, and social workers. In many cases, addiction counselors form part of the team too, but only from a supportive perspective and under the supervision of qualified healthcare professionals. Having said that, the term addiction counselor is referenced in the 1992 Act that was replaced by the 2008 Act, but I don't see any mention of this term in the newer of the two acts. It's important to note here that the term addiction counselor isn't very well defined anywhere, even in the 1992 Act. The word counselor on its own isn't protected under any law except where registered counselors are concerned. I'll go into a bit of detail here a bit later. On its own, the word counselor can be used by the postman without any repercussion, and this irrespective of whether or not they are qualified in any way. Always ask to check the credentials of anyone referring to themselves as a counselor. The words clinician or therapist are also unduly used. I'll go into a lot more detail in this video of what I think an appropriately credentialed addiction counselor is. The phrase addiction counselor is particularly pernicious because of the long history of addicts in recovery who might have some clean time behind them, using this as a justification to annex the phrase. In many cases, individuals graduate from rehab and then are conferred the title addiction counselor by virtue of having successfully completed a rehab program. I'm going to explore the concept of an addiction counselor, even if it is from the perspective of the 1992 Act, because there are still so many people working in and out of rehabs that make use of the term. There are some bodies like the Board of Addiction Professionals South Africa that are making an excellent attempt at trying to regulate this kind of thing. Their aim is to provide its members with their own board that holds them accountable from an ethical perspective and to also promote proper training of its members. But it's not a legal requirement for an addiction counselor to be registered with them, and they aren't recognized by the South African Qualifications Authority as of yet. Having said that, I don't want to minimize their efforts. They're doing a decent job. The 1992 minimum norms and standards say that addiction counselors should be accredited and registered with a recognized training and registration body. Again, I'm making reference to the old act because the new act doesn't provide for a definition, and addiction counselors are still actively involved in many treatment centers. I looked up the 1992 minimum norms definition of the word accreditation, and it gave me the following definition. The official authorization of a service by a public body legally entitled to confer that authorization by the laws of a country based on a prescribed set of quality standards. So the government mandates a body in South Africa that is legally required to recognize professional bodies, professional designations, both statutory and non-statutory, and specify quality standards is the South African Qualifications Authority in terms of the NQF Act 67 of 2008. So this essentially means that if somebody refers to themselves as an addiction counselor in the context of rehab, they should have some reference in terms of their qualification to a registration with a professional body that is recognized with the South African Qualifications Authority. So the only two bodies that are registered with the South African Qualifications Authority in the context of counseling are the Association for Supportive Counselors and Holistic Practitioners, also known as the ASCHP, and the Health Professions Council of South Africa, also known as the HPCSA. I did a search on their website for the term counsellor and I found this: registered counsellor, holistic counsellor, specialist wellness counsellor, supportive counsellor, and wellness counsellor. So say for registered counsellor, these are all professional designations that are associated with the ASCHP. So before we continue, we need to define what statutory and non-statutory mean. In brief, statutory bodies are established as a result of an Act of Parliament and govern the practice of specific occupations in South Africa. Non-statutory professional bodies have no statutory authority to regulate any trade, occupation, or profession. A non-statutory professional body exercises professional authority by virtue of its constitution or founding document, which binds its members only. Membership and registration concerning a non-statutory professional body is also voluntary. Recognition by the South African Qualifications Authority does not give statutory powers to non-statutory professional bodies. So the ASCHP and its associated designated professionals are not statutorily recognized and as such are not legally required to register with the association. So this means that anyone can still label themselves as one of the types of counsellors mentioned above, without registering and without any repercussion or consequence for using those titles. Registered counsellors are associated with the HPCSA, a statutory body. So this means that their board and title is protected by legislation, and anyone falsely referring to themselves as a registered counsellor could be liable to imprisonment, a fine, or both. Having said all of that, it looks to me that in terms of the 1992 minimum norms and standards for treatment centres, if anyone refers to themselves as an addiction counsellor, they need to either be registered with the ASCHP or the HPCSA. Again, the 08 Act doesn't define the term addiction counsellor, and the only time where the word counsellor is protected specifically by legislation is when used as the phrase registered counsellor, where a registration with the HPCSA applies. Either way, it's important to note that addiction counsellors, as defined by the 1992 minimum norms and standards, should not provide clinical interventions. They are there to provide a supportive role in an administrative context, and also to assess, inform, motivate, counsel, educate and assist patients, but only under the supervision of professional mental health care workers or social workers. These competencies are strikingly similar to that of the competencies and the scope of practice of HPCSA registered counsellors, and I would have to say they would be the safest category of counsellor to provide the service and functions outlined by the 1992 minimum norms and standards. So in my opinion, and based on my investigation and analysis of what all of this stuff means, you ideally want to be dealing with an addictions counsellor that is registered with the statutory body, in this case the HPCSA, and registered counsellors seem to be the most appropriate option that meet those conditions. It's the closest to resembling the definition of an addiction counsellor as outlined by the 1992 minimum norms and standards. So as a recap, doctors, professional nurses, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and as mentioned, in many cases addiction counsellors all form an important part of the treatment process and provide services as part of an integrated team. So let's get stuck into some more detail around the types of treatment providers that might form part of a treatment team in a drug and alcohol rehab setting. In general, the professionals on a team will fall into two broad categories, so those that prescribe and those that don't. Our focus in this series of videos is going to be primarily on the group that doesn't do any prescribing. So we've mostly dealt with addiction counsellors, whatever that means exactly, and hopefully I've made a good attempt at defining what it means. So let's move on to psychologists. Before we do, remember that there is a difference between a psychology professional and a psychologist. So psychologists can be psychology professionals, but not all psychology professionals are psychologists. Registered counsellors, for example, are considered psychology professionals, but they may not refer to themselves as psychologists. In order for someone in South Africa to legally refer to themselves as a psychologist, they need to, as a start, obtain their master's degree in psychology. So to put what this means in context, it takes 3 years to obtain an undergraduate degree in psychology, plus a further 1 year to obtain an honours degree before acceptance into a master's program. So getting into a master's program is not as simple as straightforward as it sounds. Hundreds of students might apply in their first year of studies, and only around 10 students are accepted into each master's program ultimately, and only after an incredibly stringent and difficult selection process. After another 1 to 2 years of completing one's master's degree, an additional 1 to 2 years are spent training in an internship or community service process, colloquially known as ComServe. So in total, it takes between 6 to 8 years depending on which scope of psychologist you're training for. Once completed, the individual then registers with the HPCSA, or the Health Professions Council of South Africa, which is a statutory body as mentioned. The HPCSA and in turn psychologists are regulated by the Health Professions Act and its associated policies, which are enforced by the HPCSA. So anyone like a psychologist who's in a profession that is governed by a statutory body like the Health Professions Council of South Africa must be registered with the relevant South African professional body in order to use the respective title and to legally practice the profession. The Health Professions Act, Act 56 of 1974, has designated that the Health Professions Council of South Africa be formed, which it was in 1974, as a statutory regulator. The council promotes healthcare, determines standards of education and training, and sets and maintains standards of ethical professional practice for professionals incorporated by the Health Professions Act. The Act and the policies of the HPCSA also protect the profession of psychology. It also outlines the different scopes of practice for different categories of psychologists. An important point to note is that only a person that is qualified in one of the categories of psychology and also registered with the HPCSA may call or label themselves or refer to themselves as a psychologist. This also extends to performing any act pertaining to the profession and its respective categories. So in short, if you're not a qualified psychologist and registered with the HPCSA, you may not perform any act specific to psychology or refer to yourself as a psychologist without risking being fined, jailed, or both. I've often heard of individuals claiming to use complicated therapeutic approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy after doing a crash course with an online training institution. So it could be argued that using these therapies would be illegal in terms of the Health Professions Act unless the person is registered as a psychologist with the HPCSA. So I have asked the HPCSA for comments on this, and as of the date of making this video, I haven't received a response. I think it is an important point and clarity is important. This is why the words counselor or therapist can be very confusing, and people have and do take advantage of this. Psychologists are at times colloquially referred to as counselors or therapists or clinicians, despite these not being official terms for psychologists. So these terms aren't protected by the Health Professions Act and have been used at times as a front for unqualified or underqualified individuals who might misrepresent themselves as psychology professionals. Some of these individuals often claim to have an internationally recognized accreditation, which is generally nothing more than an online crash course. So just a reminder, and as mentioned before, registered counsellors are psychology professionals and are registered with the HPCSA and governed by the Health Professions Act and its associated policy documents. They cannot call themselves psychologists, and their scope is far more limited than that of a psychologist. So I'm going to spend some more time in another video going into way more detail of this type of category of psychology professional and also how it relates to rehab. Again, if you aren't sure whether someone is a psychology professional or not, you can ask them for the HPCSA certificate or the HPCSA registration number. So I hope you've taken some valuable insights from this video. I've still got a lot of ground to cover, so if I've left anything out, please let me know. In my next video in the series, I'm going to be doing a deep dive into the different categories of psychologists. So I hope to see you guys soon.